but also to learn from other partners who are doing this work in other parts of the country. So let's open the meeting by acknowledging that we are all, wherever we are, on the unceded ancestral land of the Coast Salish peoples, the traditional home of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Squamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. We do the land acknowledgement to recognize and respect the indigenous peoples as traditional stewards and continuous resilient stewards of this land that we live and work on. With that, I will move us quickly to introductions. I know we have a small group, and if folks could just say your name, your organization, and then I'll give a quick overview of what we have planned out for our discussion today. So I will start. Patience Malava, Executive Director at the Housing Development Consortium, and I will tap Steve to introduce himself.
Everyone, Steve Gelb with Emerald Cities Collaborative. And Ryan?
Hi, everybody. Ryan Nino with the Raffin Company. Robert.
Hi, everybody. Robert Shepard with Vital Housing. And Seth.
Hey, everyone. Seth McKinney. I'm with Ecotope. Oh, yeah. Sharon.
Hi everyone, I'm Sharon J. I'm in the city of Denver and going to be speaking later. I don't know who else is left. I wasn't keeping track.
So is Sandra.
Sure, hello, sorry, I had to find the unmute. Sandra Mallory, City of Seattle's Office of Sustainability, and I will turn it over to Bernice from City of Denver.
Thank you, Berenice Garcia Tejes, Equity Administrator for the Energized Denver team, here from Denver. Nice meeting you all.
Welcome, Bernice. Abigail?
Hi, I'm Abby Corso with Elevate, and we'll be talking about our one-stop shop later. My colleague, Hank.
Hello, I'm her colleague, Hank. Hank Love with Elevate. Glad to be here today.
Thank you, Hank.
No, I don't know who else is left.
Madeline?
Hi, everyone. Madeline Kostic from Seattle City Light. Julie.
Julie Nielsen, Interim Community Development Association. Wow, that was apparently harder than I thought. Ariella.
Seats back here.
Ariella, if you're speaking, we can't hear you, but we'll go with Perry while you unmute. Perry, you want to introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, everyone. Perry England, Vice President at McDonnell Miller Facility Solutions.
Bambi, do you want to go next?
Bambi Chavez, HDC Member Programs and Services Coordinator. And I can't see y'all because I'm sharing screen, so go ahead and call someone else.
Joel?
Hey, good afternoon. My name is Joel Millar. I'm the president of Impact Capital, CDFI here in Seattle, primarily lending towards affordable housing. And we are interested in this program because we are rolling out a new clean energy fund for renovations and retrofits.
Wonderful. Thank you. James?
Yes.
Want to introduce yourself?
I think we lost him.
Oh, we lost James. Okay. Anyone else that I missed?
Dan Boyle here.
That was everyone. Yes, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Dan Boyle, City of Seattle Office of Housing, HomeWise program, multi-family projects.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
With that, we're moving along to the next piece, which is to provide an overview of our agenda really quickly. We will talk about our policy recommendations so far and take a look at the results that came from the survey. And then we'll get an update on the audit updates, on the audit work so far. And then we'll hear from our partners at Elevate Energy about their work in providing technical support for building retrofits. And then Steve will facilitate a Q&A. And right after, we'll hear from the team from the City and County of Denver on their work on building performance standards. And then we'll close with a question and answer session. With that, we're moving over to the draft policy recommendations on building performance standards that have really been informed and shaped by the discussions that this task force has had over the months. And Bambi, I'll go ahead and share screen if that is helpful.
If you have that up.
Yes.
There we go.
There we go. So you'll recall that our discussions were aimed at agreeing on what our principles are, what is the path that we want to get to as a sector, in particular as we talk about existing buildings. And the principles that we've garnered from these discussions are that as an affordable housing community, we are committed to a net zero carbon portfolio. And this is in recognition really of the impact that we know to be front and center on the communities that we serve, the low income communities, the Black indigenous and communities of color who are first and worst really impacted by climate change. So it's mitigating that impact proactively. And then we've committed though in advancing that work that the policies that we support should not financially or operationally burden affordable housing providers, because we know that many of our providers and members already operate on tight margins and really wanting to be sure that as we support this work, we're also making possible the financial resources to advance the changes that we're proposing. And then we've also emphasized the commitment to really share in the benefits of more efficient and cleaner buildings for both residents and housing providers, which comes in many different forms. It's the health benefits, it's the utility cost reduction benefits, it's also the operational cost reduction benefits, but long-term it's also the sustainable environment that we are working towards.
So, your settings, you have to make it brighter.
Ariel, okay. Wonderful. And then in terms of our actual policy recommendations or program recommendations, we have tiered this into 4 areas that I will highlight. You've reviewed these in surveys that you've seen so far. You've also discussed this in the past. So I want to make sure we have time for you to delve into discussion and be sure this is reflective of some of your thoughts and ideas that you've shared. We identify the need for technical assistance, and this is where we recommend that the city provides a roster of qualified third-party providers that can really help be a one-stop shop. And if that cannot be provided, we are also recommending that the city provides those services of a one-stop support for upgrading buildings in order for us to achieve that net zero carbon portfolio goal. And that technical assistance would cover a number of things, from the energy audits to the electrification assessments, to the actual modeling or planning earlier on for many of these projects, to also increasing access to some of the existing resources, like the weatherization assistance that we know to be there, but is very limited currently, but increasing access to those, and also any utility and other funding resources that are out there. The other additional need for technical assistance is in the construction management piece for the actual implementation of upgrades over time. We've also identified a need for the city to develop standards and a roster of providers for capital needs assessments. I think we've had quite loud and clear how CNAs really show up and how the financing timeline sometimes does not work for housing providers as requirements are coming online. So can we get providers who are operating under defined standards and are also identified as sort of a roster of providers to support a lot of our multifamily subsidized housing owners. And then under the technical assistance bucket, we've also identified need for technical assistance around environmental testing and making sure that some of the cost related to that is paid for by the city or by some funding support that is identified in this process. We've also talked about the technical assistance necessary for some of our historic preservation or landmark regulation buildings that we know need that, especially the older buildings that were built in different times with different standards, and they would need cautious, really dedicated technical assistance for them to come up to the standards that we're committing to here. The second bucket is on this germane one that I think we've had loud and clear on, which is the multi-layered funding that's necessary as well as financing overall. The recommendation that we've identified is that we have a one-stop shop access to all funding. So from the weatherization assistance to utility to city funds that are available, but really having that decentralized in order for us to get to a systematic overhaul of existing buildings with the kind of trajectory that this task force has identified. It's also getting financial support for the early project planning that needs to happen, the electrification assessments that need to happen, and integrating those into our CNAs. And then we've also identified that there needs to be grants for the actual infrastructure upgrades when those are beginning to occur, because we know that is the gap. And then there's also need for grants for some of the special remediation, in particular when you're thinking of some of the toxic material considerations here as we make the alterations required under our policies. And then we've identified alongside the grants that having non-programs that can help finance some of this work would be helpful long-term. And then the next bucket is on exemptions and alternative compliance. And this really recognizes that buildings that were built in different times under different standards are not going to be very easy for us to just upgrade. And Steve can speak to a lot more to some of these compliance path options that we've identified, but it really recognizes the challenges that these, in particular, older buildings face and being able to come up to code as we change as our cities grow. And then we're also looking at the ways that we can consider, if possible, delaying compliance for some of the buildings to fit with the tax credit timing, which I believe this task force has really expanded as an area of need. So I won't spend much more time on the exemptions, but we'd love to hear any other thoughts or feedback that folks have. Then we've talked on the policy front and want to learn a lot more today from the city of Denver on how they are approaching their work, because we've talked about not only a performance-based metric, but we've also talked about focusing on the energy, on the greenhouse gas emissions overall and getting us to that goal of a net zero carbon. And there will be, I think, room for us to learn more from other cities about how they're moving forward their policies on this front. With that, I will go back to the top here and pause for reactions, additions, and any discussions that folks want to elevate on the recommendation. If anything that was missed that you want covered? Great.
Hi, this is Bernice. I wonder if you can elaborate more in the environmental testing page for environmental testing, asbestos, lead, etc. testing page idea. The number C under technical assistance and standards.
Yeah. Steve, if you want to speak to this, this has been identified as a need by a lot of our providers.
Yeah, I think that's a concern of older heating systems often have asbestos wrap pipes and asbestos wrap systems, and that adds you need to find out if that's true or not and test for it, and then you need to remediate for it. That adds a lot to the cost over and above the normal cost of system replacement. So I think that's, we're just trying to identify what extra large costs could be that could be prohibitive for affordable housing providers.
Thank you.
Thank you. Steve, over to you.
Okay. I'm going to share I'm giving a quick update for OBrien Company, which has been involved with doing audits. Just remind you, our goal of the audits is to assess a broad range of affordable housing buildings of different types in order to understand what they might need to do to comply with the proposed BPS standard and what obstacles there might be. So this is just an interim update. You can see, I think we were targeting 15 buildings. I think there are about 12 to 14 we're going to end up with. These are the different owners and ages of buildings range from early 1900s to over 2000, year 2000. And we tried to separate from the main uses of energy, the heating system and the domestic hot water system of all gas, electric and gas, and then all electric. And then you can see the EUIs, some of which are somewhat predictable, some of which are less so, but the target EUI, I'm blanking now, it's somewhere in the low 30s is what we're targeting. So all of these are starting off with an EUI above where the potential policy will be, and that's OSE still working on that, but we just use that as a target for these buildings, and you can see which ones are complete and which buildings we're still working on. So the work that was done in the buildings was looking at heating, cooling, ventilation, and hot water systems. As I mentioned, the fuel, but also the capacity of those systems, the age and condition. So do they need to be replaced anyway? Or do they have 5, 10, 20 years of life left? And what impact does that have? Will that have eventually on cost and so on? We're really trying to understand the cost of meeting the BPS requirements will be. Another thing looked at was barriers to electrification, especially electric capacity of the building itself or of the electrical system within the building. The condition of the envelope and whether that needs upgrade or would benefit from upgrade or it's cost effective to upgrade, and the general efficiency opportunities. So to really look at what combination of upgrades would be most cost effective in meeting the BPS standard. That's really what we're targeting, and what would that cost in these different types of buildings. So the very preliminary findings from those audits completed so far is that the electric capacity in the buildings and the need for expanding the Seattle City Light transformers could be significant hurdles. So we've heard both from a physical standpoint of room for upgrade, if it's in the building, to the cost of those upgrades of bringing more power and upgrading electrical systems could be significant. that the fuel consumption is generally happens in 1 to 3 pieces of equipment, hot water systems, heating systems that serve the whole building. So a little bit easier to target replacing those systems with electric or more efficient systems. Improving the building envelopes could provide energy efficiency gains, but are usually have significant cost and require major renovation. We'll talk about that in 1 second. And upgrading lighting usually has modest gains in efficiency at a low cost. So don't get us very far towards the BPS standard, but are still a good investment. And lastly is there are concerns around the replacement of major systems triggering substantial alteration, which means that a building would need to comply with all components of the energy code. And I actually had a little dialogue with Dwayne Johnlin, the code advisor, and he mentioned that it's designed so that hopefully these system replacements don't trigger it, that if you replace, I think it's two systems it's triggered, and those systems are the building shell, the electrical system, and the mechanical system. But if the electrical system is only being upgraded to provide for electrification, it's exempt from the rule for substantial alteration. So we'll have to look at these buildings and figure out in which cases it would trigger and it wouldn't substantial alteration, because that would bring lots of additional cost and complexity to the projects. So I'm going to stop there. Any questions on the audits? Okay, so to keep us on
I have a question. How long it took you to came to those conclusions, to those results?
How long did it take us?
Yeah, the time frame for these audits.
Well, we started the process, I think, in February or so, February, March. I think the biggest challenge of the audits is it's aligning with the building owners and finding time to get in there and so on. The audits themselves go pretty quickly and you can get results pretty quickly. But yeah, so we've been working on it 2 to 3 months now.
Thank you.
Yep. So it's my pleasure to introduce Abby Corso, who is the Chief Strategy Officer at Elevate Energy. And I've known Abby for many years. She shared their audit tool with Emerald Cities many, many years ago. She probably doesn't even remember that, but we're using pieces of it to this day. But Elevate has been working in the multifamily sector, doing a one-stop shop approach to energy efficiency for many, many years. And we invited Abby and Elevate because a lot of the questions that came up in our recommendations were around the city or a third party providing a one-stop shop type of service. So we thought we would hear from an organization that's been doing it a long time in many places and could let us know what they do and where this is headed. So welcome, Abby.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Thanks, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I'm here with my colleague, Hank. We have a little presentation, a slide presentation, and we're just going to kind of tag team it. For those of you who are not familiar with Elevate, we are a nonprofit organization. Most of our staff is actually in the Midwest, where we kind of administer a lot of our programs. We do have staff in Portland, and we have one person in Tacoma, and then in California. So we have a bit of a West Coast, Pacific Northwest presence, and our work in Portland has been really squarely on the multifamily sector. We've been working in the subsidized buildings and kind of bringing them through the Oregon Multifamily Efficiency Program that the Housing Finance Agency runs. But we're just going to kind of talk high level really about a kind of our approach to a one-stop shop. I think a lot of it is not going to be new, but I wanted to just, you know, kind of just talk with you about it and answer questions and just, you know, be helpful as you're implementing, you know, the building performance work in Seattle. So I'll share my screen, and then Hank, if you want to kind of kick us off.
Sure.
Hopefully technology will be friendly to me today. All right. Can you all see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. Great. All right. Okay. Hank, you want to
put in reading mode?
I'm working on it. There we go.
All right.
Okay.
We're in
yay.
business. Okay, everybody. Affordable housing one-stop shops. What are they? So we'll talk about some what one-stop shops are and some complementary programs that work very well with them. Go ahead to the next slide. So one of the things you need to look at when you're setting up a one-stop shop is figuring out what type of building stock you are targeting. And that can be, you know, by the type of affordable housing, whether it's public, subsidized, or the naturally occurring affordable housing, the types of buildings, single family, small apartments, large multifamily, or its ownership structure, and whether it's owner occupied, renter occupied, or community owned, like a condo or land trust. But it's hard to reach every single building of every single type. So sometimes it's good to figure out what your real target is. Go ahead to the next slide. So in this case, you know, we're looking at, you know, subsidized and unsubsidized multifamily housing, larger buildings in relation to the building performance standards. So here's an analysis of the city of Seattle's housing characteristics. We usually do this when we look at a market to figure out where the building stock is. And you'd probably be looking over to the right in the 20+ unit buildings, which there's a pretty consistent number of unsubsidized housing stock in both of those 20 to 49 and 50+ units. But by far the largest number of unsubsidized housing stock is in the large buildings, 50+ units. And then of course, there's a huge amount of market rate housing. Go ahead to the next slide. So another important component of a one-stop shop is figuring out what you're optimizing for. There's a lot of different outcomes you can optimize for. You mentioned quite a few of them in the lead up. You know, are we trying to reduce utility burden? Are we measuring carbon reduction? Are we improving occupant health and safety? Are we preserving affordability? Sometimes those outcomes are at odds with one another, depending on the market structure or, you know, the cost barriers to doing some of those types of improvements. So you do need to decide what you're really optimizing for. I know EUI is a big one for the BPS, but there's a lot of other impacts that you listed that you wanted to get at. So it's really just a process of refining how you make those trade-offs. Go ahead to the next slide. And then there's the question of the types of upgrades and the scope of what you're really looking at funding and whether you can fund it directly or you need to braid funding from multiple sources together. That was already mentioned. You kind of need to find those other sources, weatherization or home repair, health and safety funding, lead, asbestos removal, and pick which types of upgrades you're willing to offer directly and can subsidize or offer deals on financing, or that you'll try and connect building owners with to get access to. So again, it's hard to do it all. If you could do it all, that would be amazing, but it's a huge amount of resources and a large scope of work that requires a lot of expertise to implement. So you got to be a little bit selective based on your resources. Go ahead to the next slide. And so the key features of the one-stop shop are that you make it easy on the building owner and the occupants, that there's a single point of contact. They help you walk you through the whole process and navigate resources that are available to them that you can provide directly or might exist in the market that you can really help ease their ability to access them. You provide them technical assistance, the audits, the oversight of construction, and the process of going through the building upgrade. Connect them with any available incentives and financing that's available to minimize their overall costs and help them just move forward with their project, and then provide quality assurance to make sure that what's installed is meeting the goals of what the whole program is, so that you're achieving energy savings or carbon reductions or health and safety improvements. And something that's important to us, I'm sure is important to you, is that there are tangible resident benefits. We can't just provide a lot of services to building owners and enrich them. We do want to see positive impacts on the residents, and then can come in a lot of forms, either reductions in their energy burden or utility burden, improvements to their health and safety, stabilization of their rents or preservation of affordability, or other things that you can optimize for. It might be like kind of a bigger picture, like, you know, social impacts of carbon reduction. So with that, I will turn it over to Abby. And you're muted.
Yeah, thanks, Hank. So this is just kind of a way that we tend to organize the market when we start a one-stop shop, whether it's in a BPS program or more often than not in the Midwest, because we don't have a lot of built BPS programs starting in the Midwest, is really when we're starting a retrofit program or electrification programs. And we really focus on a community-centered program design, and it's based on the document that you went through kind of at the start of this meeting. It feels like there's already been a lot of conversations, a lot of community-focused work done. We really, like as Hank said, focus the approach, you know, on the owners and residents, and that includes kind of how we're doing outreach and enrollment, how we're providing technical assistance, putting that pool of qualified contractors together, and then monitoring and reporting. And then there's all these other elements that maybe aren't necessarily, you know, focused in the building, but are really important to kind of help move the market, if you will. So maybe increase acceptance for a BPS, or get more owners into the program. And that is really kind of increasingly supporting diverse contractors within the program, so that the contractors that are doing the work in the building are from the communities where the buildings are located. Resident programs, super important for electrification. The work that we've done, the electrification retrofit that we've done in the Midwest, and we're in the process of doing several buildings of all different sizes. We're really finding that, you know, making sure that we're modeling the changes in the energy use at the residential level, like for per unit level, is really important, because we do find that there are instances where we're increasing resident unit loads because we're adding cooling to the building. So it's a really kind of critical piece of the electrification work. Providing that gap funding, so having an outlet for owners. I know there's Craft 3 is in this market, and so having, you know, a kind of mission-based lender, you know, who can provide the gap funding or financing, and then financing products. Let me just move on. Another way of just looking at our process is we do provide that single point of contact, and that's really like the most important part of our one-stop shop model, is having that single point of contact, so that you have somebody there for the owner who's working like on behalf of the owner. So kind of we work as an owner's representative in most of our programs, and we're really providing them, the owner, that contact, and then behind the scenes, you know, that single point of contact or navigator is putting everything together on the behalf of the owner. So they're helping the owner access incentives, they're helping, you know, the owner access grant money or financing, you know, helping kind of, you know, understand the energy audit. There's just a really long list of things that single point of contact is responsible for, depending on the program design. And then we typically have a construction manager who kind of helps the owner with the installation. Sometimes that's a single point of contact, that person. Sometimes we bring in a more construction expertise depending on the building. Like for instance, in our electrification work, which is a lot of it's very complex compared to a energy efficiency upgrade. We tend to bring in somebody who's well-versed in construction to help manage the trades on behalf of the owner, and manage those contractors. Just an example of a typical retrofit program for us. You know, the work that we've done in multiple markets, we kind of have, we do mostly customized programs. So that means that the owner, you know, gets an audit, kind of like Steve, you had, you know, that really looks at all the opportunities in the building. And then we work with the owner to, you know, prioritize what needs to be installed to meet their objectives. But we use this figure for some owners because it really helps them to kind of understand costs, you know. And
hey Greg, it's Ellen at Community Roots Housing. I hope you're fine today.
Hi. And sometimes, so we'll see, like, you know, a low-hanging fruit package is about $600 a unit or less. A next level that includes, you know, some appliance replacement and some air sealing and insulation is about $1,000 to $2,500 a unit. More intense, so this is, you know, heating and ventilation replacement, and then kind of full air sealing and insulation, particularly in our market if like sidewall work needs to be done. We're in the $3,500 to $5,000 per unit, so per unit now. And then on the solar or electrification side, we're actually seeing anywhere between $8,500 and $15,000 per unit, depending on, you know, the complexity of the upgrade. Like for instance, if the electric panel needs to be upgraded, or if work needs to be done at the delivery level at the transformer. So this is just kind of a little bit of a roadmap, you know, that helps start assigning costs to what a full retro package might look like. I'm just going to kind of skip over this. We kind of I put this list together of the work that we're doing kind of in all different markets. And how we're approaching it, because I know that there's a lot of conversations around being able to cover program delivery and as well as grant money for the upgrades. And we totally support that in our programs. And we really feel like if we're going to get owners to move to actually upgrade their buildings, not having a compliance mechanism in place in many of the places we're working, it's really critical that program delivery. So that's the cost for the audit and the one-stop shop navigator, and, you know, all of that help that's needed to actually move the building from identifying the opportunities to I think in this case meeting the BPS standard, but in our case it's actually just getting the building upgraded. That program delivery, it's critical that get paid for in our opinion. And then we do put some grant money into the programs. So like for instance, in Chicago, we're providing this is a single family and a multifamily electrification upgrade program. We are providing grants for the upgrade at about $8,500 to $10,000 a unit, or for a single family home. And then we are providing the program delivery costs. And we're doing the same in Madison, where we have a program starting in Middleton, Wisconsin, all very similarly designed, where we're bringing grant funds to help with the upgrade, but the cost of like the one-stop shop, the program delivery, the navigator is paid for on behalf of the owner. And just a sense of what program delivery is costing us. it's anywhere between probably maybe $2,000 a unit up to maybe $4,000 a unit. And that's just for delivering the program and kind of figuring out what's needed in the building and helping the owner kind of through that kind of flow chart from, you know, intake, from, you know, eligibility and intake to final design. And happy to provide more information about any of these programs. So we have been doing a fair amount of, you know, work with BPS programs, and mainly just helping kind of understand, you know, the needs of multifamily of owners within a BPS program. So some of the things that we're seeing kind of across the conversations we've been having and the programs we've been involved with is that, you know, understanding the market characteristics is important. You know, for instance, we did some work with the city of Boston to really help them understand how many small buildings they had, because they were really trying to like level set the appropriate building size for their BPS program. Access to data is a problem everywhere. And, you know, having those utility partners to help with that. Again, resourcing program delivery, we think is really important. Kind of figuring out compliance pathways. We did a series of interviews with multifamily building owners on BPS, and it was really interesting. You know, some of the suggestions by those owners around compliance pathways, and it definitely, you know, for subsidized versus unsubsidized, there was different suggestions that, you know, for some of the unsubsidized stock, especially on the smaller side, you know, that there has to be different compliance requirements, making it a little easier or kind of not as hard to comply. So there's, I would encourage you, you know, if you already haven't talked to owners around compliance pathways, it would be really good to get their input. And then one thing we are working on is portfolio management resources. So I know that, you know, that BPSs are, it's a building, it could be a building specific program, but if resources could be obtained to work with owners who have portfolios of buildings that are going to need to comply with BPS over a period of time, helping them work through their portfolio at the front end so that they're planning, that they can plan, you know, based on the life cycle of the building and refinance periods, or they can plan for reserves. I think it's really helpful to kind of take that, work with owners to take that kind of 5 to 10 year time horizon, you know, in their portfolios. But I think they'll, you know, they'll be able to, I think, more easily comply and maybe even comply sooner. So that is all that we have today. I'll send the slide deck to maybe Steve. I'll send it to you if you want. It has our contact information here, and you know, I think we're going to do some Q&A today, but if anything comes up after, you'll have our contact information. So I'm going to stop sharing.
Great. Thank you, Abby, very much. We are a little short on time. We're a little over where we want to be. So maybe a couple of questions, if people have questions for Abby before we move on to our guests from Denver. Anyone have any quick questions?
Abby, I had a quick question. You said data access was one of the biggest challenges. What were some of the successful ways that you were able to gather data?
We have, you know, getting like bulk downloads from the utility on behalf of the owner. So like a lot of times we can't get whole building data in our markets. So at least having the utility at the table so that they can, you know, be prepared to be providing whole building data in a way that is usable to owners. And then just timelines, again, working with the utilities on timelines. One of our, one utility in our Portland program, it takes more than a month to get information. So I think there's timing, there's getting whole building data more accessible, are two barriers that we see, that we have. And then helping owners, kind of use that data. We, in our benchmarking programs like Chicago in specific, we're using Portfolio Manager. So making sure that we have a API connection, with the utility to Portfolio Manager so that the data can go, can easily transfer in. Hank, anything you're seeing is with the municipalities you're working with?
Yeah, it all varies basically by the utility and whether they have easier ways to download data. Some of them have like a landlord portal, so you can get access to all of the resident utility data, and some of them have nothing. So it's really dependent on what the local utility has. But if they're looking for ideas, it can be helpful to kind of guide them in the direction by showing them the use case.
We're lucky we have benchmarking, so we have all that data available to us from our utilities. So I'm going to thank you very much. I'm sorry I had to cut questions short, but I want to give time for the folks in Denver to speak. And Bambi or Patience, were you guys going to do the intro? I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Steve. We're going to move ahead and introduce Katrina Manigan, who is the Director of Buildings and Homes at the Office of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency at the City and County of Denver. And she is going to be talking to us about the role of equity in Denver's BPS policy development process. Katrina, over to you.
Katrina, we can't hear you. Oh, you can't hear me? Oh, just barely.
Oh no. Hopefully. Apologies. I had not spoken yet on Zoom. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Alrighty. You can hear me?
Yes, that's very strange.
No.
We can hear you now.
We can hear you.
How about now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
It's good.
Oh my, all right. Hopefully I can hear you too, but that is far less relevant. Okay, so thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you so much for having us here today. I really hope that, and I know we'll have the opportunity to learn from this group also with what Seattle develops. We love this kind of idea exchange between cities. So with that, I'll introduce sort of what the whole Denver team is gonna cover. I'm gonna briefly cover how equity was considered as we developed our building performance policy, and then Sharon will speak to the policy as it's getting implemented. Berenice will cover how we're engaging the community and really grounding implementation in equity. So I won't take that long because I'm just the story, but I am the story of doing the thing that you're doing now, right? So I'll start us off. Go ahead and go to the first slide. Just quick context, commercial and multifamily buildings are responsible for 49% of emissions in Denver. The large ones are 82% of the square footage. We have a goal to bring all buildings to net zero energy by 2040. So if you go to the next slide, you can see a little over a year and a half ago, we formed the Energized Denver task force, and we challenged them to improve health and equity, create jobs, and bring existing buildings to net zero energy by 2040. And I wanted to show you the list of who was part of this group. As I understand, you are a affordable housing kind of sub task force of a larger task force. Is that correct? Or you're advising on affordable housing specifically for Seattle's policy. So we had those folks, just you can see who is here, and I see not, so that's good. who is at our table with an affordable housing and broader focus on under-resourced buildings. We had the Urban Land Conservancy, which is an umbrella organization for a lot of our affordable housing providers, everyone from sort of homelessness to affordable home ownership fall in there. Sorry, that's the Neighborhood Development Collaborative. The umbrella Urban Land Conservancy actually owns some nonprofit buildings and community serving buildings and develops them. Denver Housing Authority, of course. Energy Outreach Colorado does a lot of energy services with affordable housing. So we had pretty good representation in the task force developing this to really help us think about how to serve under-resourced people in Denver. And so we also, I'll just mention, as you look at this list, because we sort of have a standard, if we're developing policy, we're going to have 40% people of color on a major policy decision-making group. So this is 25 individuals. We did have 40% people of color. And so really just at least tried to make sure we had diversity in that sense also. I'll go to the next slide and just show you the process. Their second meeting was entirely an equity workshop to develop their racial equity lens. Then we sort of reviewed approaches from other cities and things in meeting 3. And then they got into the details of what should we require around energy efficiency in meetings 4 and 5. What should we require around electrification and renewable heating and cooling in meetings 6 and 7. So if you go to the next slide, you can see what I want to show you is how they applied the racial equity lens to each piece of that discussion. So Brown is what sort of the city brought to them. How do we advance racial equity while getting to net zero energy? And they had questions in their racial equity lens around how do we actually deliver benefit to people of color? How do we avoid unintended consequences for people of color? And we got more specific than that on those 2 questions, especially as we went into the discussion with actual metrics. And this is what you're going to now hear from the rest of the team on how we're following up on this, right? But how do we actually reduce energy burden? How do we improve housing quality? And I'll touch a little bit on some of these electrification benefits. It sounds like you're already looking at that, but the task force, I'll just say, ended up feeling like not only was electrification critical to reach the climate goal that we set out before them, and we are the first city in the country to require existing buildings to electrify upon system replacement when cost effective, and it's partial electrification, but that's pretty new. And it's because you get safer spaces, you get better air quality, you get improved housing quality. And so they really got into sort of how do we measure those benefits and measure those and make sure we're avoiding those unintended consequences. You'll hear more from Berenice later on how we're really doing the community engagement they demanded of us. They did some during the task force process, but there's this is ongoing use of sort of this work. If we go to the next slide, you can see, and Sharon will go into all the details. So basics, our policy requires a 30% improvement in energy performance through EUI targets by 2030. Here's how this works for an office. I'll let Sharon explain the details. All the offices have to get down to 48 EUI by 2030, and every building will have its own path there. I want to spend a little bit longer because while this had an obvious equity benefit of reducing energy burden, electrification is the one where the task force, I think, saw more opportunity for benefit for under-resourced communities. The last thing I'll note here, and you'll hear this in Sharon's description of how the policy works, is that the task force was adamant that we should not exempt under-resourced buildings. And they really did think of under-resourced broadly as affordable housing, but also naturally occurring affordable housing, commercial buildings and spaces serving under-resourced people with under-resourced businesses in them. And they said all of those buildings that are in our most under-resourced communities, and they said they need this energy savings the most. So make sure you just deliver that benefit in a way that is equitable, deliver the benefit to them first, don't give them like an easier path or a way out through this policy. They need to comply first. You just have to help them. And Sharon and Berenice will go through all the ways they're doing that. So a little bit more on electrification. And I'll go pretty quick through this because you're probably familiar, but as they looked at electrification, we're really talking about space heat and water heat, because that's what all the gas is used for. If you go to the next slide, you'll see, the big thing that they focused on a lot in the task force is that this improves equity because it improves safety. We know from task force members' own experience doing retrofits in low-income apartments that today, 30% of low-income homes in Denver have gas equipment that fails carbon monoxide tests. And they don't have carbon monoxide detectors 90% of the time. So this is a real health and safety issue to have all this gas equipment, especially when it's not as well maintained in low income buildings and homes. If you go to the next slide, the task force, of course, also this is a really high impact climate benefit because we have zero emission electricity coming. I think you already have close to zero emission electricity, so you're ahead of us there. And of course, methane is a super potent greenhouse gas. On to the next slide. I think you know this stuff, so I'm going pretty quick, but the goal is we get better outcomes for the same cost. So our policy may be the first to require electrification of existing buildings, but it just requires what can be done at near cost parity. It's not going to get every building to fully electrify, but it's a start. If you go, because some systems are easy to electrify. So if you go to the next slide, you can see, last thing, we always get questions, how does this impact the grid? We are a summer peaking grid today. So you have a lot of extra capacity, winter peak down low, summer peak way up high. We can electrify most of the buildings and homes in Denver and still not surpass our summer peak. So it actually just increases grid utilization. Next slide. So this is what the task force did, and you'll see Sharon present this in a bit of a different way, right? But I think seeing it in two different ways might be useful. So first, we're gonna start offering incentives this year. Second, we're gonna make permitting equal for gas systems and heat pumps, because today it's really easy to permit a gas system just like your old gas system, and it's much harder to permit a heat pump. We'll offer incentives for heat pumps to get the market ready. The third phase is that we will require heat pumps for easy to electrify systems in 2025, hard to electrify systems in 2027. And at that point, our incentives are only for under-resourced buildings. So we will continue to support them with compliance. Half of the incentives in the first two phases will be for under-resourced buildings, at least half. Okay, so going on, there's a lot of incentives. This is just, I wanted you to see what the task force said. They said this, I mean, with a little more detail, and then you're gonna hear from Sharon and Berenice how they're doing all of this, right? So there's lots of incentives and support and outreach. And the next slide, the task force had a big focus, as I mentioned, on providing a lot of extra support for under-resourced buildings so that they get these benefits first, so that they comply first in terms of technical assistance, financial assistance. I think that's it. Next slide. Yep, I'll pass it to Sharon to tell you a lot more detail, but and I'm happy to take any questions you have on the sort of like, how did the task force arrive at this set of recommendations? But I hope that's helpful just to hear a little reflection on how their discussion went. Yes, the source of funding for incentives. We're very lucky. Our voters approved a 0.25% sales tax funding our office to the tune of $40 million a year. So about a quarter of that will be dedicated to buildings and homes. We're rolling out $40 million over the next 3 years of incentives for commercial and multifamily building electrification. So we are unusual that we have our own pool of funds as the city to complement the utility incentives and other programs out there.
Wonderful. Katrina, can you say more about the source of funding?
I actually can't hear all of you, I realized, so I'm gonna just stop. I'll maybe rejoin. Thank you.
Thank you.
We maybe save that one for the end because I know we're going to have probably all kinds of questions, and I personally can't see the chat very well while I'm presenting the slides. So I think I'm going to save my questions for the very end after Berenice. For my section, I'm going to focus more exclusively on the performance requirements or the building performance standard. If you all want to delve into the electrification a little bit more, I can come back to another meeting if you really want to dive into that side of it. Katrina gave you a really good overview, but I'm going to I'm going to focus in on this part of it because this is where we're building out all of our details right now. So the overarching goal of the performance requirements was to get a 30% improvement in energy performance across all covered buildings. So the individual buildings are not necessarily making 30% improvements. It depends on how far away they are from their site EUI target. And so that's a good distinction. I previously worked in Washington, D.C. on their building performance standard, and their reduction was 20% across the board. It didn't matter kind of where you were if you didn't meet their standard. So there's a lot of different options around building performance standards right now in the different cities and the way they're setting it up, but we're based on site EUI targets. And so what we did was all of our buildings over 25,000 square feet benchmark. So those are the ones that the energy performance targets are set for. It's based on site energy use intensity. So it's all about what energy is being used in the building. And what we did was we took our benchmarking information for all of the 3,000 buildings that meet those criteria and set the targets at the 85th percentile for all of the covered buildings in Denver. And that was what the task force decided was going to be the goal for this first round of trying to get to 2030. It doesn't quite get us to our climate goals for 2040, so we are going to have to do something in that next decade. But this was what they thought was attainable by the market, building market in our city. And so what this means is that 85% of the buildings do not meet these targets and have some type of reduction that they have to meet in their buildings. The top 15% are the ones who do meet the targets, and what they have to do is actually just maintain that target and stay so that they're meeting their target EUI. For mixed use buildings, as long as they're benchmarking correctly, we actually took the top 3 largest building types and gave them a mixed use. So let's say you have 20% of the building is a restaurant, which is at 194 target EUI, and the rest of the building is an office at 48, you would get a blended target based on the percentage of the building types that are in your building. So what we did was we set our 2030 targets. So you see the example of the office where the target EUI for 2030 is a 48. And then we took their 2019 baseline and drew a line and set some interim targets. So we have an interim target of 76 for this particular building, but that might not be the same for Office B. It all depends on where they were in 2019. We want to help them get along the path to be able to hit that 2030 target. So that's what the interim targets are for. What they also have to do is once they hit that individual target, they have to maintain it. So they have to make sure that they don't go back above or are less energy efficient than the target in the in-between years and then also after 2030. So this is the minimum that we are regulating. It doesn't mean that the building can't move faster if they want to. If they want to do a major renovation in 2025 and go ahead and hit that target, that's fine. But what we're saying, these are our minimum levels that we're regulating. So this is a super important concept that you are probably going to have to invest some time and money in your one-stop shop for your building owners. We have found that a decent percentage of our building owners are not actually benchmarking correctly according to EPA portfolio manager rules. So we are having to spend some time, especially when it comes to putting in their square footage correctly or choosing the right types of building types inside their building, you know, making sure that they get that 10% restaurant and 90% office so they get that credit for that high intensity space. And so we are having to spend a decent amount of time right now trying to get people to correct their benchmarking data. A lot of them were just throwing information in the system and submitting it, and that satisfied our requirements. We weren't checking to see whether or not they were correct. So it's a very important part of this process. So one of the other things I think is super important, the idea that Katrina mentioned about exemptions and not exempting for certain situations, what we designed was some alternate compliance options that are going to give flexibility for us to be able to handle case by case basis, certain buildings, some special characteristics, that kind of thing. And so actually our only exemption is demolition. If you have a pending demolition for your building, that is the only way that you are exempt from the performance requirement, and basically will use these alternate compliance options to work with you to adjust the target accordingly, depending on your particular building situations. So we're offering a target adjustment, which looks at variations in operations where maybe we need to adjust for a 24-hour control center, or like an inherent characteristics, like say you have an indoor swimming pool that's really high intensity and not accounted for very well in benchmarking. Those are some of the things that we are going to be able to do, either some standardized adjustments based on the information that the building owner gives us, or some non-standardized adjustments where they may do some energy modeling to turn into us that where we would adjust their site EUI from there. The timeline adjustment, we want building owners to be able to account for end of system life, maybe the timing of a major renovation or other similar reasons. One of the other ones that I saw on your list was about historical buildings. Historical buildings might also do a target adjustment and a timeline adjustment. Let's say they do an energy audit, they find out they can't do certain things, then we might give them a target adjustment, but then they had some delays with the local historical preservation board, and they have completely delayed their timeline, so they can't meet one of those 2024 targets or 2027 targets. Then that's when we would give them a timeline adjustment. They're definitely not exempt, but we want to be able to have some flexibility. We also are offering a prescriptive option, but these are only for the interim targets, where if somebody is 90% LED and 70% electrified, then their interim targets would be satisfied. They would just still have to hit the 2030 target. And these are mostly for our smaller building set. And then for under-resourced building adjustments, we think the flexibility in the target and the timeline adjustment are going to be able to work with our under-resourced buildings. What we're more focused on is either adjusting the process or providing more additional technical assistance to help them meet them. We want to make sure that they're getting to the same place as all of our other buildings and making sure that they realize the same kind of benefits. So this is how we're adjusting for different considerations. And so this is just a little bit of a slide talking about the data correction of your benchmarking data versus what we would actually do to target the adjustment or adjust the target. And so we're hoping that we are going to assume that everybody has actually corrected their benchmarking data before we actually do a target adjustment. So I think that concept is really important. Here's an example of one of the apartment buildings that has actually done the work already. They used to have a site EUI of 73. This is a apartment complex that qualifies as affordable housing and went through an organization called Energy Outreach Colorado, where they got some assistance to be able to meet some target EUIs. And so they realized 58% energy savings from these upgrades that Energy Outreach Colorado helped them with. And so what they have to do now is just make sure that they maintain their EUI. We're not regulating the 30 or the 31 that they hit in the last couple of years, but as long as they stay more energy efficient than the target of 44, then this building is already in compliance and has already done the work. So we also have small building performance requirements that are very prescriptive. So we wanted to also provide benefits for the buildings between 5,000 and just under 25,000 square feet. So what they have to do by the timeline on the chart on the side is either install all LEDs for a lighting upgrade, or install solar or enough to meet 20% of the building's annual energy usage. So if we have a building that currently meets this, all they have to do is turn in paperwork. So we have about 8,000 buildings that are in this particular group, and it's very, very prescriptive of what they have to do. So this is our implementation timeline before I turn it over to Berenice. In November, our ordinance went through City Council. In January, we did a first version of our rulemaking. We are actually going to be doing a second updated rulemaking, probably starting in August. It's going to include a whole lot more details of exactly how we're going to work out the procedures around our alternate compliance options. We have the framework, we just don't have the detailed submissions. So that's what we have to update. We emailed and mailed the EUI targets to the building owners on March 15th, so everybody knows what their current EUI targets are, and a lot of them are doing data correction so that we can adjust their targets. We launched an updated website, which is also going to go to a version 3, probably in October. And we have a third-party contractor that is our one-stop shop that actually staffs our help center. So we expanded that in March to be able to handle the new round of calls on the performance policy. Berenice is doing a lot of community outreach to URB is our short term for under-resourced buildings, and she's going to talk about that in much more depth. We are doing some stakeholder engagement in the next 2 months about the alternate compliance options and what their procedures are to get some feedback, and then do an updated rulemaking in August and September. And then based on Berenice's outreach to our under-resourced buildings, then we're going to be launching that additional technical support probably in September for the under-resourced buildings. So now I am going to turn it over to Berenice.
Thank you, Sharon. Can you go to the next slide, please? I believe, next slide, please. I believe Katrina and Sharon have already mentioned a lot of details of our ordinance. I just want to mention what we're putting together to help those people who really need it the most, those buildings that are on underserved areas that support affordable housing, frontline communities that provide human services to our community, and also those buildings that are important for our community. So we have identified these 4 metrics that we're using to develop an internal method to identify under-resourced buildings. And as you can see, and I believe also you have an equity index, I check the City of Seattle website that you can use to identify where these buildings are, especially the dark areas that you can see are locations where people have a high income stress, the asthma rates are high, they had redlining in the past, the racial composition, mainly people of color, utility burden is high. So we want to help those buildings that are located in these areas as well. Next slide, Sharon. Next. As Sharon mentioned, I'm doing a lot of outreach to identify who they are, where they are. And at the same time, I'm doing community engagement to build trust and have communication with the community leaders, building owners, managers, and key partners. And all of that will help us to design and co-create with the community services and incentives. Next, please. Why is it important to do community meeting? We need to build trust, to understand the needs and the barriers of this community, and also to build knowledge and understanding of our BPS. Also to gather insights on how we can address the energy burden and the housing conditions for these communities, and then co-create services together. And also to receive input on where we can serve better and implement incentives to help these buildings meet the energy performance requirements. And also to identify, as Katrina mentioned at the beginning, unintended consequences to avoid them. We don't want more gentrification in Denver. And also identify pilots for electrification, solar, energy efficiency. We want these communities to be the first to benefit from these energy savings and the first to electrify. And what else we can do to help these communities with other services that the city and county of Denver offer. Next, please. This is just an example for an upcoming meeting I'm going to have in 2 weeks in one of our underserved areas in Denver. The neighborhood is called Westwood. This meeting will be with building tenants from major buildings identified as URBs. The meeting will be in Spanish with English interpretation and Vietnamese interpretation. We're going to provide food, transportation, compensation for those participants, and I'm collaborating with community leaders to make this happen, empower them, and to hear from them. Next, please. And then we have an internal prioritization where building owners are going to fill out a form. They will tell us what affordable housing, we serve frontline communities, what are human service providers. And based on all these points that an internal committee will review, we're going to identify to whom we provide the first, second level of services, similar to what Abigail mentioned. For example, a priority building will be a multifamily in one underserved area where 70% of the renters are Latino families. Next, please. And of course, as Katrina mentioned, we want to provide tangible benefits to these communities. These are some services that we have planned. We're doing a lot of outreach. We're meeting them where they are. We are also engaging community groups, direct one-on-one support. We're going to have a portal with services and provide this technical assistance that we're co-creating with them to see how we can assist them. You just gave me an idea about the asbestos and the lead. Maybe that is something that they need as well. So we are hearing from them. Next. And then we're going to have a portal that will be our one-stop shop for under-resourced buildings, where they will have education and learning, how they can help tenants, what rebates and assistance is out there from our utilities, our financing companies or organizations, rebates, ARPA money maybe they can use for these projects, and also what else the city and county of Denver can offer. For example, all our neighborhood services, housing assistance, human service support, and what else we can do. I have heard from multifamilies that they would love to have recycling. So how can we implement that? So we always get input from the community. And I think that was my last slide. Thank you.
Well, amazing, Berenice, Sharon, and Katrina. Thank you for sharing all of the great work you're doing in Denver. And we're really glad to be able to learn from you and understand a lot of the considerations you've made for your program. It's really comprehensive work, and we really appreciate you taking the time. I do want folks to get an opportunity to ask questions, because this is so much a path that we're going towards. And I do see that you've gone further and required electrification, which really is exemplary. And I'll be curious to hear from folks what questions they have. I do see Steve has a question up first.
Always have a question. Thanks everyone for the great presentation. So I was just curious, sounds like in Denver, you said you want to provide a lot of resources to help under-resourced buildings comply. It looked like a lot of that was providing information. You know, am I reading that right?
Yeah, so
yes, a little bit with what Elevate is doing, which providing sort of someone to handhold. And I'm trying to understand, there's a difference in where you fall on that.
What we have is some draft levels of support, which is where that prioritization chart comes in, because we've identified out of about the 3,000 buildings, we have about maybe 600 that qualify as under-resourced buildings, because our group is so much larger than just affordable housing. And we have some draft services planned, but we really want to gut check it against community services. So we're kind of trying to be very careful about what we're putting out there, that we already have something designed. But the idea is our help center would be kind of the top level, or the first level, where you can call in, get some general coaching. Basically, all of our 3,000 buildings qualify for that. They can access resources on our web, you know, get that basic information and call in and get some general coaching. Then we have a second level and third level, where the second and third level would only be under-resourced buildings, and we would have them go through an application and a verification process to make sure that we agree that they qualify for services, and that we would prioritize them based on, like what she was talking about. If we have an apartment complex that's majority BIPOC residents in a particular area and this, then they would score higher and be more eligible for, let's say, tier 3 level. And the second and the third tier are where the hand holding comes in. So at the second tier, you'd probably just have some basic hand holding, maybe let's say 8 to 10 hours of assistance. More personalized. We have some virtual energy audits through an online platform that we're going to be helping, and maybe we walk, through gathering that information and helping the person actually fill out that more virtual energy audit. And then the third level is where they're being paired with an engineering firm, and a possible energy audit is being done. And a little bit more hand-holding on how to get the information into financing applications, things like that. So we've got this tiered level of, we probably have 600 buildings worth of help at the bottom level, maybe 300 buildings of help in the middle, maybe 100 get the more specialized. And then we're going to kind of see how things go. And if we possibly need more funding to increase that number based on the need of the community, then I can always go back and make the business case of helping those and increasing the number of buildings that we can afford. So.
Yes, and just to add on what Sharon said, we're also helping them in telling them which resources and incentives are out there. For example, our utility, they replace all LED lighting for free if they are eligible. So we're also making sure we bring them this information for them to apply and get those resources for free.
Thank you. Well, Sharon and Bernice, what like the neighborhood development collaborative vision for Washington? And these are mostly affordable housing provided funding you are offering in your program. Are there grants that you've set aside? How is the coordination and support for housing providers being thought out?
I would say from the building performance side of things, it's more that we're paying for the technical assistance rather than providing outright funding. I think we need to kind of see through the energy audit processes and some of that kind of thing if we see that we may have to subsidize things a little bit more. There's some other funding sources like through the state or through the federal government. We need to see if we can maximize those first before we end up doing some city level incentives for the energy efficiency side. Where the incentives really come in from the city perspective is from the electrification side of things. So if a building does electrify as part of their building performance plan, which it does improve their site UI because they're getting more efficient equipment, then there are some incentives available there, but it's definitely from the electrification side of things, not necessarily performance. So because the electrification can come out of a different funding source, the performance policy is different and regulatory, and we're a little bit more limited as to where that funding comes from. So we're having to kind of, on the performance side, maximize all of these other resources first, and then see whether or not we are going to need to subsidize with additional incentives and just kind of go from there.
And Sharon, this is Katrina. Just to add a little color from what the task force recommended, they knew that we only have so much funding. And they said if we have to pick what under-resourced buildings are going to get funding to support, they wanted that to be really focused on electrification, because the policy there requires the electric system to be at near cost parity, but it may cost a bit more than the gas system, up to 10 to 15% more. And they wanted to make sure that we're mitigating that cost for under-resourced buildings. So a lot of the energy efficiency measures should have a good payback and a good return, so there's ways to finance those. That's the other thing I'd note.
Thank you, Katrina. Yeah. Well, thank you, Denver team. We really appreciate you sharing this information. I would be curious as follow-up to learn more about the alternate compliance parts. Some huge strokes there in what you learn. We're also looking very in-depth into a lot of that work. But
well, and we could have maybe a separate meeting where I can dig into some of that. It's not public knowledge yet. I'm doing some focus groups in June, and we have a more public meeting on July 11th that honestly anybody here can actually sit in on, where we're going to be doing a big feedback session before it goes into our updated rulemaking. But I don't mind, like I'll send you the slide deck so that you have the links and all of that kind of stuff for what we presented today. But I don't mind having a conversation about alternate compliance options and the details we're working out. I just can't share anything yet because it's not public.
Thank you. Steve.
Oh, so I just have a general question about that. It sounds like you're working a lot of the details out in rulemaking. What assures the under-resourced buildings that they're going to have enough assistance? And was there a concern when you were passing the legislation? Because we're an affordable housing group, and leaving all the details to rulemaking, what kind of assurance is that going to give that it's going to meet the needs of affordable housing owners, for example? So how did you guys deal with that?
Well, and the assurance is the word. Go ahead, Katrina.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I think that the assurance comes in that we know the individuals, we know our community, and they know that we have some real funding and that we're going to really do this and that we're going to be reviewing it, and we'll adjust it if we need to, right? With this ordinance, I'll note, went through City Council with no opposition. In fact, we had people from affordable housing, from our BOMA chapter, from our NAIOP Owners Association chapter, all speaking together with the environmental community in support of the ordinance in front of council. So I think it's because they felt like they had gone far enough and they trusted that we would get those details right. And we continue to involve those same people, plus a lot more people in the details. But go ahead, Sharon, on kind of how you're doing that.
Yeah, I think a lot of it just has to do with the outreach that Berenice is doing and some of the outreach that's happened before now. And I think some of the flexibility, we've been doing a lot of presentations and talking about the flexibility that we're trying to wrap into it. We did actually have a rulemaking in January, and it was the basic framework of how we're going to implement it. The issue we have is that we have to dig into super specific details, and that's where before November we had Katrina and one other person working on this with the task force, building the ordinance, getting it passed, and because it's regulatory, the city can't staff up to work out the implementation details until the ordinance is passed. So Berenice and I came on in January. We hired another person in February and November, and I'm about to hire another person. So basically our whole entire team is new, and we're trying to figure out what's the application, what do we want to allow for a standard target. Some of those kind of things just take a little bit more time, which is why we're doing an updated rulemaking this summer to add in all of those details. So the January rulemaking is just a super basic outline with some considerations of what would be the minimum requirements that we do have to update and add more procedural details on and minimum requirements. I hope that helps.
I'm just curious for Steve, are you guys looking at having any special funding to support affordable housing property owners on the upfront cost?
I'll defer that to Sandra.
We would love to have some special funding for affordable housing, and we'll be going after those same federal funds that every other city is going after when they finally announce they're available. We do have, we have a grant proposal in now for some, I think it's the Weatherization Assistance Program innovation funding. So waiting to hear on that. And we have some funding that we're actually some old ARA funding that was in a loan loss reserve that we're reallocating for a couple of affordable housing pilot projects. So we will request funding from the city, but it's, we have only, we have general fund, we have a more recent payroll tax. So it's always a resource issue in terms of what's provided. But I think the long-term goal is, I think, very similar, is that, you know, sort of the incremental cost, same thing, to decarbonize versus, you know, sort of maintaining, you know, asset management as a business as usual case, and trying to do this in, you know, affordable housing and under-resourced buildings first, even if in our case, we are kind of looking at some extended compliance. It's like, okay, maybe you don't have to get here by then, but hopefully so. It's the, you know, inevitable, yes, we're looking for funding.
Yeah, I was thinking this is out of the box idea that Seattle has Washington has all these Amazon and big companies. I wonder how all this primary industry can pitch in, you know, to improve their own community. And I know it's a crazy idea, but why not?
Not so crazy an idea.
Sandra, hire her right away.
No, you can't have her.
Sharon would really be mad, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'd never get Sandra. I'd have to come visit you in Seattle.
Just to be mindful of the time, we did have you here till 4 o'clock. We're a couple minutes past the hour. And so just letting you all know if you're feeling like you want to stay on or if we're ready to head out here.
I personally don't mind staying on. If anybody wants to dig into some of the details or ask more questions, it wouldn't bother me. So it's up to y'all.
I think we might have some people who are headed off already to other meetings at this point. So we want to thank you so much for being here today and sharing this information. You know, we've been in this process together since January, and it's kind of interesting to see us all in our parallel realities here trying to reach similar goals. So thank you so much for speaking with us today. And, you know, I'll reach out to you to be able to grab presentations and notes and send the notes for the meeting to everyone. And for anyone who missed it, we also will have the recording, so we'll be able to post that on the website.
Thanks, everyone.
All right.
All right, good to see you.
Have a good day.